My name's Meg. I am the education director for the Friends of Flathead Avalanche Center. So really want to thank you all for joining us tonight for our March topics class. We are super excited and of course, always very excited to have your support and just enjoy that folks are willing to chime in and get more information and get more education. So we're again, really pleased to have you here. So this evening, we're super fortunate to have our former Flathead Avalanche Center Director, Erich Peitzsch, joining us. And he is currently a research physical scientist with the USGS, Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center in West Glacier. And he's gonna just kind of chat with us a little bit about some of the research he has done in regards to climate change and avalanches and all the things that he is just been fortunate to study and spends a ton of time out there. He also helps do some educating and recently just helped teach a level 2 up with the Patrol Fund up at Whitefish Mountain Resort. So overall, just really fortunate to have him as a friend and supporter of us as well. And so I'm going to just toss it right over to Erich and he's going to take over. But yeah, again, thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you for supporting the Avalanche Center and supporting our work and supporting our forecasters. We're super fortunate to have a wonderful community behind us. So thanks for being here.
Awesome. Thanks, Meg. Yeah, thanks for being here to all of you on a beautiful Wednesday evening. I hope everyone's enjoying the weather. And let's hope that things turn around here and turn back to snow soon. We're going to talk a little bit about this kind of weather, and let me begin the presentation here. All right. And can you see that, Meg? Does that look good? Hopefully.
Yes,
okay.
You're all good.
Awesome. All right. So as the title tells you, we're going to talk about large magnitude avalanches here in Northwest Montana in our home region. But first, I want to thank all of the folks that work on my team at the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center. We are the Climate Change and Mountain Ecosystems Research Group, and without these folks, none of this research and none of our other snow and avalanche projects would be possible. So I want to thank all of them. Specifically, I want to thank my co-authors on the work that I'll be presenting mostly tonight, which is looking at our Northern Rockies an avalanche climate relationship project that we did. So thanks to these folks and thanks to the USGS Ecosystems Land Change Science Program for the financial support for this project. So let's begin starting off a little bit about weather and climate. I know everyone's familiar with the difference between weather and climate, hopefully. But I just want to quickly point out that we all know that weather is the primary driver of avalanches. This current cycle that we have going on right now is a perfect example of how weather really drives avalanches. Warm weather, rain to higher elevations, triggering a variety of avalanche problem types. And so climate, though, drives the weather. And in the context of current and future changing climate, we need to understand the avalanche frequency and climate patterns in the past first. And that gives us the implications of a changing climate on avalanches and how they can be different for different snow climates. And what I mean by snow climates is the maritime avalanche climate in, say, Washington and Oregon and in the Sierra in California versus, say, a continental snow climate or avalanche climate type in Colorado. We in Northwest Montana are in an intermountain, so sometimes we experience conditions closer to the maritime climate, like right now, and sometimes we experience conditions that are more similar to Colorado in a continental climate, where it's cold and often they have a shallow snowpack, but We don't necessarily get that shallow snowpack very often. We do, but not very often. So that's why it's important to sort of understand the past so that we can understand where we're going in the future in the context of climate change. So there's been recent considerable media attention about climate change impact on avalanche frequency, particularly last year when we had a really tragic year with 37 avalanche fatalities in the US. And everybody, wanted to blame climate change. And it's part of the story, but last year, every season is different, and we can't just take one season and use that as the example for this is what's going to happen because of climate change. There's interannual variability, so one year could be a big year, another year could be a really crappy year. For example, crappy meaning like not a lot of snow and really bad riding and skiing. But it's pretty difficult to disentangle the signal between avalanches and climate, because avalanches depend, as I just mentioned, primarily on weather and snowpack structure. And while climate acts as this sort of second order background driver. So for example, one study found that an increase in wet snow avalanches due to warming in a portion of the Western Himalaya from the early 1900s to the early 2000s. But in France, different authors found different things. In the French Alps, they found a decrease in dry snow avalanches from the 1970s to the early 2000s. And then more recently, in a smaller and lower elevation mountain range, some of the authors found that there's actually an upslope migration of avalanches, so they're not running down slope as far. There's an earlier peak in avalanche activity earlier in the season as opposed to later in the season, and these avalanches are a smaller size too. Now, keep in mind that's just one small mountain range. It's not the entire Alps that we're talking about, but it is an indication. And climate change is going to have different effects in different regions. Speaking of different regions, so what's happening here in Northwest Montana? We wanted to find out. As I mentioned, we're classified as an intermountain avalanche climate. Again, sometimes we get periods within a winter that are more similar to maritime and others that are more similar to continental. And the more continental climate is more prevalent on the east side of the Continental Divide. So if you spend much time over there, then you are pretty used to sort of a more continental avalanche climate. So to find out what's happening, we wanted to answer two specific questions. The first one is, are there specific seasonal climate or atmospheric variables that contribute to years with large magnitude avalanche activity? And this is across the whole region. And I'll define the region here in a bit. And then secondly, can we use these relationships that we've identified between climate and avalanches to actually quantify or detect any trends in avalanche probability through time? So is the probability of more avalanches going up or is it going down? So before we dig in, why do we actually do avalanche research? So we all know that avalanches are a hazard to humans who recreate in the backcountry. And that's probably why most of you are here, but they're also a hazard to travelers, along Highway 2, close by, along I-90, along I-70 in Colorado. And they're also, along the railway. They disrupt commerce and they pose a threat to basically anyone who works in avalanche terrain. They also serve as a landscape disturbance. So they modify vegetation by removing sometimes large swaths of forests, and they can both create and decimate animal habitat. So when an avalanche comes down, it might actually create new habitat for both vegetation and animals, but it also might decimate habitat for other animals and certainly plant species. So the bottom line is avalanches have a really big impact on our landscape and our society and ecosystems. So who uses the results Avalanche forecasters can use the results of looking at large magnitude avalanche frequency and how that changes through time and the relationship with climate. You know, one of the reasons why we had so many avalanche fatalities last year is because throughout the West, the conditions were such that people weren't used to those conditions. And that doesn't necessarily mean that climate change was, you know, the sole culprit. But what it does mean is that climate change will more frequently create conditions that we aren't used to seeing. So not just recreationalists, but avalanche forecasters. And so this work can help place the context of sort of these quote weird winters, and really, you know, let us know, like, is this weird, or is this something that we've actually seen before in the last, say, 50 or 100 years? And then the same goes for infrastructure planners. So the image on the bottom right there is that green thing that you can kind of see is an avalanche protection structure. And this is in Conundrum Creek in Colorado. So in March 2019, there was a widespread large magnitude avalanche cycle, basically across the entire state of Colorado. And this is in Conundrum Creek. There's a small neighborhood up there. They designed this structure to protect this house from the 100-year avalanche cycle. And for the most part, it did. Like, they nailed it. If I was the engineer on this project, I'd be like, yes. I mean, you know, the snow came up and over the dam a little bit. It broke a couple of windows, but I mean, you can see that house is still standing. The chimney looks a little crooked, but for the most part, things were pretty darn good given the size of the slide. This was, I saw the slide in July when most of it was gone, but we were still standing on probably 15, 20 feet of avalanche debris that was insulated by a bunch of forested debris that it took out. So infrastructure planners can use the results from this work as well. So how do we get avalanche records really far back in time? So particularly around here, we don't have great observational avalanche records really far back in time. Blaise Reardon, the director of the Avalanche Center, did a study years ago and basically kind of mined through a bunch of old newspaper archives, Department of Transportation logs, National Park Service logs, and he compiled a really good historical record, you know, the best that we have in this region. But unfortunately, it still only went back to, you know, like the mid 1900s. There were a few maybe before then, sort of anecdotal here and there, and there's always stories, of course, but a really strong record, historical observational record, just doesn't exist. And this is actually quite common in a lot of areas in the Western US. I'm really jealous of our colleagues in Europe because they have historical records, observational records that go back to like the 1700s, because people lived in villages in the mountains there. Well, since at least the 1700s and before. So, you know, we just don't have that. So what we do, or what we can do, is use dendrochronology, which is the study of tree rings. And dendrochronology is actually used in all sorts of other fields. It's used in climate reanalysis. So basically, they can look at, you know, the ring widths of trees to look at how precipitation and temperature can affect the growth of trees. So they use it there. They use it for landslide research. It's used in all sorts of things. We, of course, you are using it to study avalanche frequency over time. And we're not the first ones to do this. People have been actually doing it in the Western US using tree rings to look at avalanche frequency over time since like the 1970s. But we developed sort of a new sampling plan, a novel sampling plan that allows us to capture the frequency and magnitude across the whole region, which at that scale is much more conducive to studying climate. Because if you study, you know, use tree rings for one avalanche path, that's just one avalanche path. And we talked about variability earlier. And so it doesn't necessarily help us understand the entire region, which is more relatable to the climate record. So I'm going to play a little video here, and Hopefully everybody can hear it.
This right here we suspect could be an avalanche scar. But what we'd do is then we'd cut into this dead and down tree and then take a thin cross section from this tree. And then we can take that to the lab, process it by sanding it, looking at it under the microscope, counting all the rings, and then cross dating it. This right.
There we go. Okay. So that's what we did in the field. We mostly sampled dead and down trees. Some were dead and standing, which were nice because they were in place. Some of the dead and down, we could also tell that if there was a big hole nearby, that's where they basically came from. And so, you know, the more in place samples we can get, the better, because then we can spatially locate them. And that really helps for creating return period maps, but that's something different that we won't get into in this talk. But using tree rings, it allows for a pretty robust assessment of avalanche frequency over, as I mentioned, a large spatial extent. And this frequency, of course, differs across multiple avalanche climates, but our spatially extensive sampling plan, so across 4 mountain ranges here in Northwest Montana, allowed us to be the first to examine avalanche frequency across these multiple mountain ranges in a general avalanche climate, and then to examine frequency trends. So the example up in the upper left, you can see this is what an impact scar looks like when an avalanche hits a tree. So let's imagine that you have a tree on a slope and an avalanche comes down and hits the tree. And let's say that it doesn't uproot the tree and carry it down slope. It just hits the tree, it causes mechanical damage in the outermost part of the tree, the cambium. And so what will happen is the tree will then begin to grow around that damaged tissue. And it creates this scar on that given year, so that when we cut cross sections from the tree, we can actually date the tree, and we can then say, well, this ring is 1972, it has a big scar on it, so that's probably an avalanche. However, there are other things that can cause mechanical damage to trees. And that could be anything from rockfall to a landslide to a moose walking by and rubbing up against the tree. So we did sample, of course, in avalanche paths that were free from rockfall, or, you know, from a lot of rockfall. There weren't major talus fields that indicated there was a lot of rockfall. We didn't sample in areas that were known to be landslide areas. As far as a moose walking by, you know, we can't really prevent or really know that, but by collecting so many samples, we were able to sort of rule out that, you know, if it was just one signal for that year, then we could rule that out, and I'll get to that in just a bit. So in our study site, we collected close to 700 samples. We sampled 3 avalanche paths we'll start with the upper left here, in the Whitefish Range in the Red Meadow area. And we sampled in the lower left 3 avalanche paths in the Lost Johnny drainage. And then in the lower right, we sampled 3 avalanche paths we sampled 2 in the Highway 2 corridor above the BNSF Railway. And then we used samples from another study that Blaze did in 2005 and used those samples as well. And then finally, we sampled along the Going to the Sun Road. We sampled 1 on the east side of the divide and 2 others on the west side of the divide. So we sampled throughout this, in the 4 sort of major mountain ranges, or close to those, in the Flathead Avalanche Center forecast area. Of course, as I mentioned, we targeted transportation corridors, so there would be practical use for both forecasters, infrastructure planners. And then the other areas, of course, Lost Johnny and Red Meadow area are both popular recreation areas. So how do we actually distinguish avalanche response from noise? So in the upper left, you can see an example. This is actually a sample from Alaska. We're doing some work in Southeast Alaska as well. It's a really great example. You can see the avalanche impact scar from 1985 right here. and then the sort of the cat space that occurs once the subsequent tree rings grow around that damage. And then in the lower right, you can see another scar where you don't have that type of growth, but you still have a scar from 1974. And then there are a variety of other signals that we look for as well. So we're not just looking for scars, but another signal, again, if an avalanche hits the tree and maybe knocks it over a little bit, but it doesn't uproot it. So what the tree is going to do then is put on more wood on the downhill side. And so those rings on the downhill side are going to be way fatter than those rings on the uphill side. And the rings on the uphill side are going to be way thinner than the ones on the downhill side. And so if you have successive years like that, and again, numerous samples, we can't just depend on one tree to just tell us that, because what if that tree got knocked over for a variety of reasons? So yeah, that's why we sampled so many, but that's called reaction wood. And that's the fat rings on the downhill side. And again, there are some other samples or other signals here, like traumatic resin ducts, where you can see some damage in the cells themselves under the microscope. But moving on. So when we get these signals, how do we actually know, as I mentioned, that it's an avalanche year, right? So is it a moose walking by? Is it wind that sort of knocks it over and then the tree sort of is trying to buffer and kick itself up more upright? The first thing we do is use cross sections. So in this image, you can see the center of, let me get the cursor out here. Hopefully you can see this, the center of the tree. And those black lines that are horizontal and vertical indicate what would be if we just used a core. So you may have seen people using cores. It was on a previous slide. And you kind of turn the increment bore into the tree, and then you turn it back out, and you get a tiny little thin section of the tree. And you can do that to living trees. It doesn't hurt the tree. But the problem when you're trying to find avalanche signals is that you might miss some of those signals. And so you can see in this image here that if we had sampled, and when we do cores, we do sample on 4 radii, or at least 2 if the tree is small, so it goes all the way through. But we'll sample here, and we would have missed the center of the tree, which is actually a little off center of this cross section. And then there's a scar here in 1933 that we actually would have missed. So we actually sometimes underestimate by up to 30%. So in this study that we did, we found that we took sort of a subsample and pretended that we used just cores instead of the full cross section. And we found that we just using cores, we might have underestimated by about 30% the avalanche signals. So, it's not to say that just using cores doesn't work, but using cross sections gives us the full story. So that's one way that helps us distinguish between an avalanche signal and all other noise. Another one is we apply certain thresholds. What that means is every year, it's based on the sample size for each avalanche path and the number of growth disturbances per trees alive in that year. And so there's different sort of filters that allows us to say, well, if we have a big sample size, then we basically need more growth disturbances, so more signals to tell us that it's an avalanche year. And so the more samples we have, the better. And then finally, the higher quality responses are weighted more heavily. And by responses, I mean that when we see a scar, that's sort of a really high quality response. And that's like, yes, this is definitely an avalanche year, especially when we see it in numerous samples for that year. And so we weight those more heavily than, say, the reaction would for maybe just a couple of years, because maybe that the tree, for whatever reason, tilts it over and then is just putting on some reaction wood to straighten itself, because that's what the tree wants to do, is it wants to be straight so that it can get as much sun as possible. So those higher quality responses we weight more heavily. All right. So what did we find? We had almost 700 samples, and in those 700 samples, we had over 2,000 growth disturbances. So that just means that we had a bunch of growth disturbances within each sample. The mean age of our tree was 73 years old. Our oldest tree was 367 years old. Any ideas where you think that might be? Throw it in the Q&A. So was it in the Swan Range, the park, or the Whitefish Range? Throw it in there and I'll let you know at the end. And then we came up with, after all the filtering, we came up with 30 major large magnitude avalanche years in the region. And that's from 1867 to 2017. So we're talking about the 30 big years. So years on the bottom here, and the vertical lines are those 30 major avalanche years. Now, this sort of shaded area right here is our sample size. So you can see that back in 1860, we didn't really have that many samples, and our sample size axis is over here. So between 0 and 50, we had, maybe 25 samples that go back all the way to the mid 1800s. And then of course you can see that it increases and quite dramatically as we get into the late 1900s and early 2000s. So that's our sample size, and that's an issue, right? And that's the problem with using trees to give us an avalanche signal, is the avalanche takes out the trees. And so we might, it'll take out the trees, and then, but if it leaves the tree, it'll leave a signal on the tree. But if it takes it out, then there it goes. And now it's not going to leave a signal for that year. So that becomes an issue. So that's why we use that thresholding right here based on the sample size and the number of growth disturbances per trees alive in that year. And so what that basically normalizes the sample size across time for us. And you can see here that the number of growth disturbances, of course, is going to increase as the sample size increases as well, particularly in those big avalanche years, 2003, and then 2009, 2014, and then again in 17. Okay. So, and I see a few questions popping up in the Q&A, which I appreciate. And I might, let's see, did you account for an increase in population and access to avalanche areas? So yeah, we did, as I just mentioned, over time, we were, because of the applying the thresholds to discriminate the signal from the noise, that allows us to normalize the sample size through time. And hopefully that answers the question. If not, we can chat more about it at the end. So here we have years on the bottom, and notice that this is only to 1950. So we had avalanche frequency records all the way back to 1867, or avalanche years rather. But when we went and started to compare the climate records, we had robust climate records and all the variables that we wanted to include. We could only really use them from 1950 onwards. And so we completed the climate and avalanche analysis from 1950 to 2017. So keep that in mind as we move forward here. But you can see that the annual mean, and this is snow water equivalent on our y-axis here. And so the green line is the average snow water equivalent through this entire period of record. So, about 725 or some around there is the average from just before 1950 to 2017. And so you can see that from the 1950s to the mid 70s, we had a bunch of good years, above average snow years. And all the red triangles designate the major avalanche years that we identified in the tree ring record. So all of those years occurred, at least from the 1950 to the mid 70s, and during above average years. Now, as we move into the 80s and 90s, or at least the 90s rather, we begin to see that we have avalanche years, actually big avalanche years, occurring during low snowpack years. And not so much over here, in the late 70s, but there's a decade there where we didn't, we had low snowpack, but we didn't have large magnitude avalanche years, at least identified in the tree ring record, until around the 90s. And in the 90s, we actually have a pretty even distribution above and below normal of these avalanche years. And so these 7 years from 1990 to 2017 are below average, occurred during below average snowpack years. So keep that in mind. We'll revisit that in a second. But I wanted to show these two. If you're not familiar with box plots, that's okay. So the blue boxes are our identified avalanche years, and the red are our non-avalanche years. So all of the years in here that don't have red triangles. And what we're doing here is basically comparing the distribution of the avalanche years versus non-avalanche years. So that's what that yellow arrow, the two-sided arrow means. So for both snow water equivalent and snow depth, there is a significant difference between avalanche years and non-avalanche years. So avalanche years occurring basically in years with greater snow water equivalent and snow depth overall, right, over the whole period of record. And the same with precipitation as well. Precipitation in January, March, and annual, which is winter. So not the whole year, just the winter precipitation. They occur on average during years with more precipitation in January, March, and the entire winter overall. So that's good, but it still doesn't tell us the whole story. And so we used principal component analysis, which is sort of like a statistical salad bowl. And we put all of the climate variables into the salad bowl that we wanted to look at. So that's temperature, precipitation, snow depth, snow water equivalent, and then a variety of atmosphere ocean indices like El Nino, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, PDO, the Pacific North American Oscillation, the Arctic Oscillation. So all of these indices, and we threw them in, and then, well, first we threw them in the bowl, and then we combined it. We threw in our avalanche records. So we wanted to basically find out, like, of all these variables, first, which ones are actually related enough, just the variables. And that's what we used principal component analysis for. And that gives us what we call principal components, right? And we came up with 6, and I'll show you in the next slide here what those look like. What that allowed us to do is then use a regression model that accounted for the decreasing sample size back in time of tree rings. And it's a generalized linear autoregressive moving average, if you're interested, a GLARMA model. And that from there, we were allowed to, or that allowed us to come up with the trend in avalanche probability through time. Okay, so I know there's a bunch of lines on here, but this is pretty easy. So we have time on the bottom, and this is our first principal component, right? And basically what that tells us, and it's made up of snow depth, snow water equivalent, and mean winter Pacific Decadal Oscillation. But all of that combined really is telling us that this first principal component is the long-term variability of our snowpack and low pressure systems. So in one word, storminess. All right, that's our first principal component. Our second principal component is temperature. So that's the mean winter Arctic Oscillation Index and minimum temperature. And you can see, actually going back, let me go back really quickly here, that the mean PDO, the more negative it becomes, that typically is associated with colder and stormier winters for us here in Northwest Montana. And the snowpack typically goes up, even though this line goes down because the other two are inverted. Same with temperature, is that as temperature goes up, our principal component scores go down. But the bottom line here is that temperature is rising throughout those periods, and I'll show you why that's important here in just a bit. Our third principal component was El Nino, and that's the short-term variability, right? Everybody cares about El Nino, La Nina, El Nino, La Nina. And sure, it has an effect sometimes on our winters. I think this year is a mild or mild to moderate La Nina. And thus far, you know, it's been roughly an average. It was a slightly above average in terms of snow water equivalent. And we're, basically hovering kind of around average, give or take a few percentage points throughout the winter. So El Nino, La Nina they can be important, but the Pacific decadal oscillation is a longer term variability. We're talking on decadal scales, and that really drives a lot of our winter precipitation. So PDO. And then our sixth principal component is important here. So we go 1, 2, 3, all the way to 6, because it's our precipitation component, specifically spring, so March precip. And I'll talk about why in just a bit here. So when we take those principal components, we put them into this regression model, we found in the upper left graph here. So the blue lines are the probability. This is the probability of a large magnitude avalanche here. And we can see that we have a lot of spikes, but those spikes start to go down. And it is significant, just significantly different through time. So we have a decrease in the probability of large magnitude avalanches from 1950 to 2017. It's a 14% decrease, which roughly translates to about a 2% reduction in avalanche probability per decade. So every decade, the probability of seeing a large magnitude avalanche decreases about 2%. And that's coincident with the decrease in snowpack. And this is what we're showing here in panel B in the lower right. This is our height of snow. And you can see that our height of snow through time in this region has gone down. And that's at all elevations, except the uppermost elevations where we just don't have data. So this one is, again, this is our first principal component, our long-term variability of snowpack and storminess. And this is, so to the right is less snow and high pressure. To the left is more snow and storminess. And you can see that with more snow and storminess, there's a greater probability over here. And then that's temperature component is a little more scattered, but still a pretty high probability of avalanches with warmer temperatures over here. So this decrease that we see, because due to a decrease in snowpack, is actually buffered by warming and spring precipitation. So that March precipitation increase over time is helping to buffer that decrease in large magnitude avalanches. So that decrease in large magnitude avalanche probability may be even steeper if we just had a decrease in snowpack and it wasn't affected by warming temperatures and precip, potentially leading to wet snow avalanches. So going back to this graph, remember those 7 years towards the later part of the 20th century, that's likely a signal because of warming and an increase in spring precipitation. So to summarize, as the snowpack and low pressure persistence decreases, the probability of large magnitude avalanches, or the probability that's a big avalanche here, decreases. As we mentioned, that probability decreases through time from 1950 to 2017, but it's also buffered by warming and increased spring precip. So why the hell does this all matter? We know that regional snowpack losses will drive the frequency of large magnitude avalanches. So particularly at lower elevations, we're seeing a decrease in snowpack, right? As large magnitude avalanches release in the upper elevations, if particularly in early season or late season when there's not as much snow and there's more, turns out we actually have brush in Northwest Montana and it sticks out of the snow. But when there's more of that, then that creates surface roughness. And as avalanches move down slope, that surface roughness begins to slow down and eventually help stop that debris from moving further down slope. So that might be one of the reasons why we're not seeing, we might actually see an upslope migration like one of those studies in France. The question of will warming play an increasingly greater role, even more so than it has from 1950 to 2017, that's a question that we hope to answer and likely with more modeling efforts into the future. And then understanding climate avalanche relationships helps place in context, big avalanche cycles, and it actually helps us prepare for large events, particularly extreme events, right? Like these big widespread events. Like the last huge widespread event that we had was in 2014. Really briefly, what are we doing in Colorado and Alaska? We're doing pretty much the exact same work. In March 2019, as I mentioned, basically a statewide large magnitude avalanche, size D4 and 5s all over the place. This was the remnants of a cabin in one of the drainages in the San Juans in Southwest Colorado. So far, we've collected close to 800 samples, and we hope to collect more. And here's a picture of Danny looking at the microscope or through the microscope at some of the tree rings and doing a fine job of finding those avalanche signals. So in 10 Mile Canyon, sort of near Breckenridge area, we've identified 3 major years so far: 2019, 1899, and 1848. And with more data, it'll help us discriminate those other years from the noise that I mentioned before. But the nice thing is that 1899 and 1848 were also identified as big avalanche years in the historical observational record too. So here's some of the info from the historical record, and that coincides pretty well with what we found so far in our tree ring record. And so in Southeast Alaska, this is just a rain cloud plot. Basically, we're looking at return periods. So on this axis is the years, the number of years. So these are the small subregions that we identified. And then this is the entire region in Southeast Alaska. And we've identified that roughly, every 8 to 10 years is when this region sees large magnitude avalanches. In Juneau, there's a large avalanche path that affects near downtown Juneau. And you can see on this little image here off to the right, that's actually Juneau Douglas High School. Probably within, they say it's just outside of the 300-year avalanche zone, but no one really knows in terms of, dating it, because it's all urban right there. So you can't date it with tree rings. But what our tree ring work will do here is help with the modeling efforts that folks at the Swiss Federal Institute of Snow and Avalanche Studies have done, and they created this model here to look at the 100 and 300 year cycles, and you can see that the 300-year cycle is just shy of this major area over here, but certainly comes down to the roadway and into the harbor. So what's next overall? We need to collect more samples in Colorado and Alaska. And I mentioned these areas because what our ultimate goal is, we hope to compare this avalanche frequency across different climate types. So maritime climate in Southeast Alaska, intermountain here in Northern Rockies, and then continental climate in Colorado. And we want to look at, has that frequency changed through time in those different areas, and how has climate affected those? And then finally, the question is, are wet snow avalanches becoming more frequent, and how does that affect the overall large magnitude avalanche frequency? So that's all I've got. If you're curious about the other research that we're doing, feel free to visit our website. You can't click here, but just Google snow avalanche USGS, and it'll take you there. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions, and thanks again, everyone, for attending. And I guess we'll turn it over to Meg. And if there are any questions, you can either ask live or throw them in the Q&A. And it looks like Jackson has a question. Did you find that some tree species offer a more reliable or distinct reaction scar to avalanches? Not necessarily. In here in the Northern Rockies, our predominant species was subalpine fir. We also had Doug fir, and let's see, what else did we have? We had a variety, but mostly subalpine fir and Doug fir. and so they both basically will still have very similar signals. Deciduous trees are not good at all. So, like if you get like one area we sampled, there were a bunch of cottonwoods down by McDonald Creek, and in 2009, a big avalanche released up by the garden wall and went all the way down McDonald Creek over 4,500 vertical feet. Took out a bunch of cottonwoods and birch trees, but we cut a few cross sections from dead and down trees there just to see, and they were really poor. There was really no signal within those. But subalpine fir and Doug fir were pretty good. And let's see, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here, I think.
Well, we also have a guess from your question as far as the oldest tree, and
Oh yeah,
Kara, and she's asking if it was in the whitefish range.
no, it was in the Lost Johnny drainage of the Swan Range. And there we go. Yeah, it was really cool. We actually found a giant stump that had been logged. We don't know exactly how long it, well, we do know, I can't remember exactly when it was logged. And we actually tried to sample, or we did sample in areas that weren't previously logged, or at least weren't logged very recently, and tried to avoid areas where there were fires, within the past 50 to 100 years in those areas. Which made it a little difficult, particularly in John F. Stevens Canyon, because in 1910, of course, was a huge fire year, and that probably took out a bunch of our samples. But we were able to find some trees that were kind of old. So fire and logging definitely played a role. And yeah, that oldest tree was a previously logged tree, but we were able to cut another cross section off the top of the tree, or the stump, and that was the oldest one.
Awesome. Well, definitely, if you have any other questions, toss them in the Q&A or the chat. I think Eric would be happy to answer any other questions you guys have. But again, we really thank you all for chiming in. We love being able to offer these topics classes, and I think this is a fun way to do them, as far as, kind of the new norm is doing the virtual thing. But
I'm curious, and I guess we could have set up a poll, but I didn't have the foresight to do that. But
me neither.
I think, like, are these virtual sessions? I mean, in some ways they're good, because you can, like, grab a drink, grab your favorite Chardonnay, and head to the couch and watch this. Or you can go somewhere and watch the presentation live, or, like, do you want both? And so I don't know if there's a way you can get respondents, and people can chime in now in the chat. But I mean, would people rather, like, hang out at home and watch these, or would people rather watch them live still? Or do you sort of want a hybrid where you have the option of going somewhere? Like, as a presenter, I've done so many of these now that, like, it's fine, but it's still, I don't know, like, presenting, I'd rather present in front of a bunch of people. And so I'm curious what people think. Yeah. Megan prefers live, hybrid, both. All right. That's great feedback.
Both is probably.
Yeah.
But I think we would like to do maybe a spring one with a live option, because, as we've got more daylight. So everyone stay tuned for maybe a topics class that hopefully is focused a little more on some spring touring. And yeah, we can hopefully just offer a hybrid of both. But
people seem to like the hybrid.
Yes, there was a question kind of before the poll came in that asks if you can speak more to any statistical insight regarding the relationship between the PDO and average snow water equivalent here in Northwest Montana.
Yeah, they're highly correlated, but inversely. So as the PDO becomes more negative, so as the index itself becomes more negative, then our snowpack is typically greater. Greg Peterson, who is at our Northern Rockies Mountain Science Center as well, but he's in Bozeman. He did a really cool study looking at, he started looking at that, but looking at some of these indices and snowpack in general. And he used snowtail sites, but also used tree rings, as I mentioned, looking at climate and precipitation signals. So yeah, as the PDO becomes more negative, then our snowpack is typically greater. And so, negative PDO years are typically big snow years for us, snow water equivalent.
Awesome.
So it looks like there's a bunch of votes for hybrid.
Yeah. Which that makes sense, but I appreciate that there's definitely a good chunk of folks that would like to get together live again. My hope is for a spring event that we might come up with some sort of, little beer and a burger type of event and get folks together and also be able to record it and share it with everyone as well. So again, I really appreciate that folks keep chiming in to all these topics classes and keep supporting the Avalanche Center. And it's really great to just see folks coming online and I mean, we all now know that Eric is at home drinking Chardonnay, so that's it looks like we do have a couple more questions popping in. So do you think there's any impact in the relationship between large cycles and the time it takes for trees to grow back?
Yes. So like, as I mentioned, like these big cycles, that's one of the limitations of using tree rings, right? Is that it basically decimates your data source. So big avalanche comes down, takes out all your trees. You can find them at the bottom of the slope, and that helps in that, we sample the dead and down trees at the bottom then. And, but what it doesn't help with is that if those trees stayed there, then it would actually record a signal for that year. And then if there was another large magnitude avalanche the next year, it would record that as well. So that's the problem, is that if you get two large magnitude slides in a path that are basically, a year apart or even a couple of years apart, it does hinder the record. So that's one of the reasons why we sampled a bunch of samples per path. And then we sampled adjacent paths, and then we sampled this sort of sampling scheme is like nested, right? Where you have one path, and then you have three adjacent paths, and then you bump over to the next mountain range. And so that allows us to basically look at this on a regional scale. So we're not dependent on any one path. If you do have a big cycle that runs on every single path, then you might miss then the next year if there is another big cycle in every single path. So that's why our sampling scheme we did it so that would help reduce basically the uncertainty in that and sort of help alleviate that limitation.
Great. And then one more question. Does a scar appear at all heights of the tree, regardless of the location of the impact or the tree height at that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically, what we did is we sampled near the base of the tree, because that's where you're going to see the signal. So even if you have your tree, and even if the avalanche hits the tree, and let's say the bottom of the tree is actually buried under the snow pack, and so it's not being impacted. But because the way the tree grows is that scar will show up in the rings near the bottom of the tree. And so if we sampled really high, we might actually miss some of those rings. So that's, like the tree some of the trees taper. So we might actually miss some of those years in the upper part of the tree. So if we had an obvious scar on a tree, we would sample and we could still see it. We'd sample at the scar and at the base of the tree just to make sure that we didn't miss, the signal in either of those locations. But if we didn't see an obvious scar, an external scar, then we would just sample at the bottom of the tree, and that's pretty much going to capture all the years and all of the scars that might be in there. But yeah, good question.
Great. One more. Any live trees harvested mid-slope to corroborate dead or down trees?
Oh no, we're not allowed to cut down live trees. So no, that's a good question too. In the middle of an avalanche path, you'll, in some paths you can have live trees in the middle. And if we did, then we would core those trees to see if we could see the signals in those trees. So we might core those. But oftentimes there's just not that many, in the middle of the path. Like some paths there are, like in John S. Stevens Canyon, we sampled trees in the middle of the path, but they were pretty small and pretty young, like, 40 years old, not very old. So yeah, we're often limited to either dead and down in the middle of the path or in the run out zone or in along the trim line. But
awesome. Any other questions out there? Well, I think we have some pretty good feedback as far as what you guys want as far as live versus virtual. Sounds like a good combo. Oh, we got one more question. Where are you based out of? Interested in helping with sampling near and far for avalanche research?
I'm based out of West Glacier is where our office is. So yeah, if you're interested in helping out, you can email me. It's I don't know if my email's on the thing, but it's Peitzsch, so it's EPEITZ. Here, I'll just write it down here. Okay, everyone. I don't even know how to spell my name, so let me do this.
I think one of the posts on social media when we started advertising, Lloyd Morissette commented something like, "How can we trust a guy that has 5 consonants in a row in his name?"
He stole that joke from me.
Oh, okay. That's fair.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for showing up, and hopefully it was worth your time. And yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to email me. And thanks, Meg, for hosting.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was super interesting and just a lovely way to spend a rainy Wednesday evening here in the Flathead while
Exactly.
we hope for the temperatures to drop again. So
oh yeah, for sure.
Again, thank you everyone for tuning in. We really appreciate it. We appreciate your support of the Avalanche Center, and stay tuned for probably our final topics class of the season. Will be next month, early April, and we have another fireside chat planned for March 22nd, I believe. So feel free to tune in for that as well. So again, thank you all, and everyone have a great night, and let's pray for colder temperatures so we get some more spring skiing.
Yeah.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.